Evil Dead Rise is the long-awaited 5th installment in the Evil Dead franchise. It's been a whole decade since the last film, 2013's Evil Dead, which was a soft reboot to the original 1981 Sam Raimi cult classic, The Evil Dead. Oh man, I'm going to be saying Evil Dead a lot in this video, aren't I? Since the trailer dropped, there has been a lot of anticipation for Evil Dead Rise's release this April. And after watching this movie, well, I know we'll never look at a cheese grater the same way again. The movie was good, but it did get me thinking. It certainly seems like these two latest films have been straying away a bit from the full-on campy feeling of its 1980s roots. If you've seen the original trilogy, you know how ridiculous they are. In a good way, of course. I'm not saying there are no comedic parts in the film. There is some dark humor and campy elements sprinkled throughout, and they do work in this movie. But Evil Dead Rise and Evil Dead definitely aren't as silly as the originals. They utilize more serious themes to build up their characters, and have less jokes overall. The 2013 film set up this difference in tone, as even though it's technically a reboot of the first The Evil Dead movie, it felt more grave, pun intended, than its namesake. It is a great movie. But it's still a bit sad for me since the original trilogy's campiness is what made them all so iconic. In fact, the horror genre in general has drifted away from camp, certainly since the 1980s, but especially in the past decade. Films about severe topics like grief and trauma have paved their own way into modern horror, and rightly so, with the likes of The Babadook, Hereditary, It Follows, and The Night House.
It's not just some schlocky cheeseball nonsense with wall-to-wall jump scares.
Campy horror movies are still being made, but they have kind of taken a back seat. A standout as of late is James Wan's *Malignant*, because obviously. And even his newest film, *Megan*, has been called campy as well, as it has plenty of dark humor and outlandish moments. But even with these latest entries, is camp out of fashion for horror movies? The 80s were full of these over-the-top, at times cheesy horror movies that are now cult classics. But since then, the demand for that style has dropped. What does it mean when one of the campiest horror franchises now sways more towards serious than silly? Is it a step in the right direction, or are we missing out on all the fun? Let me know in the comments below if you prefer your scary movies goofy or grim. Also, please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this video and want more like this. Thanks. I guess first things first, what is camp? It's always been a little difficult to explain exactly, but you usually know it when you see it. There seems to be no one true definition of camp, but one way to describe it is as an aesthetic that emphasizes exaggeration and being over the top, even to the point of being intentionally absurd. Basically, the style thrives on bad taste and the irony of it all. In horror movies, this can amount to comedic dialogue that might be a tad bit cheesy and cringe.
Groovy.
Excessive gore like popped out eyeballs and blood sprayed literally everywhere, and even the plot of the film being a bit nonsensical. Characters might feel like parodies of themselves, and visuals can be shocking. Camp horror had huge representation in the 1980s. Evil Dead 1 and 2, along with other classics like Fright Night, A Nightmare on Elm Street, An American Werewolf in London, Sleepaway Camp, The Return of the Living Dead, and even Child's Play. Army of Darkness, the third film in the Evil Dead trilogy, also followed shortly after in the early 1990s. So why was camp so prevalent in the 80s? Well, for starters, the 1970s was a heavy decade, both in a political and financial sense with the Vietnam War and inflation, among other things. And many horror movies of the time mirrored that with realistic horror like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Don't Look Now. They were facing horror in real life, and the movies of the time reflected that by focusing on our own mortality and social commentary. So once the 80s came along, everyone was ready for a change. Films in the 1980s were all about the feel-good vibe, and that seemed to seep into horror movies in the way of cheesiness and humor that contrasted against the genre itself, and excessive, at times ridiculous amounts of gore that accompanied surrealist and otherworldly themes. The 80s were full of camp, and the filmmakers and the audiences fully embraced it. So, in full camp fashion in the early 1980s, in came the original The Evil Dead. It blended horror with comedy, with absurdity on both sides. In fact, it was quite controversial when it first released, since the gore was so intense and relentless. The villains, those being the Deadites, were ruthless, but also had some pretty funny one-liners.
It's your sister, Cheryl!
The acting was over the top, with Bruce Campbell making a name for himself and becoming a staple of the franchise. Sam Raimi's directing style in the film is punchy to say the least, with lively camera work that moves in and out wildly, but in a way that emphasizes all the action. When the movie first released, it wasn't the biggest hit at the box office though, but since it was such a great film critically, it did benefit from word of mouth and eventually became a sleeper hit, making nearly 8 times its budget. The success of this film led to 2 direct sequels, a television series, a soft reboot, and now Evil Dead Rise, which is sort of an indirect sequel to that reboot. The Evil Dead is now considered a campy cult classic and widely regarded as one of the greatest horror movies of all time, likely due to it being so extreme and original. The film franchise does vary its level of campiness as time went on. Evil Dead 2 was even funnier than the original, adding more camp and slapstick comedy than its predecessor. Many consider this to be the best of the 5 films, as the comedy and horror elements are so well balanced, and a bigger budget certainly didn't hurt. I would say the camp level for all 5 movies overall would resemble sort of a bell curve, with the maximum silliness and humor occurring during Army of Darkness, and Evil Dead Rise having the least amount. Well, I never thought I'd bring math into a discussion about the Evil Dead. Also, the 3-season-long TV show Ash vs. Evil Dead was a great addition that builds upon the original storyline, maintaining that groovy, comedic vibe from the initial movies. However, the newer films have less comedic moments than the originals, but do keep the tradition of graphic, extensive amounts of violence. Evil Dead and Evil Dead Rise pay homage to their roots, but set themselves apart as well. They are nice additions to the franchise, but they lack in the quirky, campy ridiculousness that the first films thrived on, and I do miss seeing that. Evil Dead Rise is the most straight-up horror out of all 5 movies. The Deadites have always alternated between goofy and cruel, but in this film their comical side was lacking a bit. Still, the movie does have some campy moments that I love. For example, a person's eyeball gets launched from one mouth into another. Also near the end, the gore and camp does ramp up significantly. The last 20 minutes are extremely over the top, covered in blood and guts, and filled with one-liners and irony. There is one part where Beth says something cool and confident and then immediately gets knocked over. It was amazing and definitely got a laugh out of me. Overall though, I was left wanting more of that unique ridiculousness that made the original trilogy so special. So why this change in tone? The reason behind the silly to serious tone shift could be a result of the current horror genre landscape. The past 10 years have really made way for high art, trauma-driven horror, very different from that of the 80s. Movies like The Babadook and Hereditary have become synonymous with modern-day horror and received huge critical acclaim and dedicated internet followings, to say the least. The Babadook was a groundbreaking film, focusing on the psychological side of horror, and even for me, felt a bit like a drama at times. Hereditary was one of the scariest movies I ever saw at the time of its release, and it definitely thrives on that seriousness. The movie is steeped in depression, as it tackles grief and generational trauma. The jump scares are graphic and haunting, and if you watch this movie, I know a certain shot was ingrained in your head. Anyway, the popularity of this subgenre of horror could have inspired the team behind Evil Dead and Evil Dead Rise to tone down the silliness and amp up the emotional stakes. Even from one movie to the next, we went from mainly a group of friends as our main characters to a family with children. I mean, what's next? A litter of puppies picked off one by the Deadites? Horror movies that feed off that deeper emotional connection and relatability to past trauma are all the rage right now. Now, that isn't to say we haven't seen campy movies recently. We've actually had a decent resurgence in camp horror and horror comedies that have hit mainstream audiences in the 2010s, with movies like Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, Zombieland, Cabin in the Woods, and Happy Death Day, among others. And now that we're in the 2020s, there seems to be an overall craving for nostalgia, with everything from clothing to movies, and one way to do that is to bring back the 80s silliness into modern-day horror films. In the past couple years, we've had successes with plenty of camp, like Megan and Malignant. Okay, well, Malignant is a success to me, alright. Campiness and comedy provide both relief and uniqueness to the horror genre, providing something different from the usual, predictable, scary movies we get year after year. This style is one of the reasons why I love the genre so much. It allows some horror movies to go beyond the expected. Horror movies can be serious and terrifying, but they can also be fun and and shocking. It shows that there is not just one way to make a scary movie. To answer the question if this shift in tone is a step in the right direction, honestly depends on the viewer. Evil Dead and Evil Dead Rise are good horror movies in their own right. I for one like to embrace camp and comedy, so I don't like these two films as much as the original trilogy. While okay, maybe more than Army of Darkness, since it's more of a comedy than a horror movie, but still entertaining. I would say it's safer to create a serious horror movie, since campy horror can be so divisive and can go wrong so easily. And it seems like this choice worked well in their favor, since Evil Dead Rise is in fact a good movie, with wonderful acting, direction, and visual and special effects. It is rightly getting plenty of commercial success and critical acclaim. I wish they continued with the comedic elements, but that didn't stop me from enjoying this movie. And of course, we do have the TV show for those of us that miss that ridiculousness of the originals. Evil Dead Rise might be more serious than its 1980s predecessors, but the few jokes they put in there happen in the right places. But I am a firm believer that camp belongs in horror. I hope there will be more films in the future that aren't afraid to be over the top and even a little bit
groovy.